You're listening to Frontlines, a podcast for the people that truly make mountain biking happen. Not the riders, racers, or product designers, but the builders, advocates, and the often forgotten board members of your local mountain bike trail association. When you think about mountain biking and its locations, there's the staples that come to mind. There's the often credited birthplace of Marin County, the Mecca that is Moab, the birthplace of freeride on the North Shore of Vancouver, and the living and breathing mountain biking utopia that is Whistler, BC. But what is mountain biking's heartland? What happens when we remove the mountains from mountain biking? One quick scroll around North America on trail forks will tell you that mountain biking doesn't stop east of the Rockies. And so, what is left when you remove the mountains from mountain biking? It's my belief that the quintessential parts of who we are as mountain bikers remains. That thing that brings us all together when we're not arguing about wheel size or IMBA, the essence of what makes mountain biking and digging in the woods so important to our well-being. Maybe places like the Midwest of the United States. Places like Duluth, Minnesota. Is Minnesota mountain biking's heartland? I don't know if I can pin it down to just one place. Maybe that's what makes mountain biking so special. But one thing I do know is that this sport's heartland is not in places like Moab or Marin. I'm your host, Brent Hillier, and this is episode 33 of Frontlines. Before we dive into this episode's interview, I just want to remind you of the Frontlines MTB book club. A portion of anything purchased on Amazon after following the links on the book club page will go to support the podcast. The last recommendation is This I Know, Marketing Lessons from Under the Influence by Terry O'Reilly. It's a helpful guide with some do-it-yourself marketing strategies. So if your budget won't allow an ad agency, then this book is a far more affordable alternative. You can grab a hard copy or a version for your Kindle at frontlinesmtb.com. And if you have a recommendation for the book club, then please reach out. Now on with the show. My guest is Hansi Johnson. He's the director of Recreational Land for the Minnesota Lands Trust. Previous to that, he was a regional director with the International Mountain Bicycling Association. Hi, Hansi. Welcome to the show.
Hey, thanks for having me.
Looking at Duluth today, we see a ton of trails and what looks to be a very vibrant riding community. But I assume that there was a time before all that. When was that, and what did Duluth look like then?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, I think Duluth looked like a lot of kind of Midwest communities as far as mountain biking was concerned. Early on in the sport, there were always mountain bikers here. I mean, as soon as the sport sort of started popping in the early to mid 80s, there were folks that were riding and enjoying different trails here in the city. But they tended to be kind of more, social trails and old hiking trails or ski trails or things that weren't necessarily mountain bike trails. They were unplanned. They were somewhat maintained. There was a local club that started in the late 80s. And started maintaining some trail, but it was by and large a social group that was just getting out and riding and enjoying their bikes.
And so really, and you kind of said it there, your average mountain bike community at the time.
Yeah, I think, as far as the explosion of off-road cycling didn't just occur in the mountain states. It was happening across the country and especially in the upper Midwest and the Midwest. And a lot of us, myself included, I didn't live in Duluth at that time, but as a kid, got a bike at 13 or 14 and assumed I could just ride it anywhere and tried to. And two things generally stopped that. One was me breaking my bike all the time because it just couldn't take when I was riding it. And two, someone telling me no, that I couldn't go there because there was some other sort of managed activity that was happening there. And I think, Duluth was very similar that way. If you if you knew where the riding was and you knew where you could go and you knew where you could, do it in a way that you weren't going to get in trouble, that's where you were riding. It's sort of a don't ask, don't tell policy. But, Duluth is a little different than some of the kind of Midwest towns in the fact that we have a huge, just massive amount of open space within our city limits. So, Duluth is this weird, long, thin city on the shores of Lake Superior, and it has, I don't know, somewhere in the nature of like 15,000 acres of undeveloped land within its borders, which was a lot of kind of old, industrial space or space that was going to be utilized for industry that just never was because the economic collapse in the 70s. So there was, long story short, there's a lot of places to ride your bike.
IMBA launched their regional director program in 2009, and that's when you came on board as the Upper Midwest rep. How important was that role to Duluth and the rest of Minnesota and the Midwest?
Really, and I of course, this is coming from me, who was the Midwest Regional Director, so I'm obviously a biased source. But I really felt that the chapter program, the regional director program, the IMBA Ride Center program were some really robust tools for us as Midwesterners. A lot of the issues that we were dealing with weren't necessarily of the same nature as the mountain states, regardless of whether they were east or west, whether that was, large amounts of like federal land. We were dealing more with large amounts of really locally managed properties. So state, city, county kind of situations. And, we also have kind of an interesting situation here in the fact that we tend to have clubs in fairly populated areas. So we have bigger cities, bigger communities. We still have lots of available space depending on, obviously which community you're talking about. But the main point being was the ability to kind of build capacity and create vibrant organizations that could really kind of advocate and create what they wanted to do in this region was maybe even more of an opportunity. So those tools really, I think, having the boots on the ground and the folks kind of getting out and doing some really great instruction on best practices, not only on how to build trail, but how to build your organization, and then giving them tools to kind of aspire to, like the Ride Center, was a big push for us, as a kind of as the Upper Midwest is concerned, and the Great Lakes for sure.
So something that you've mentioned in the past is that when you came on as regional director, something that you noticed was that none of the advocacy groups in the region were speaking to each other. And that's actually one of the reasons why I started this podcast, was because I made a very similar discovery in my day job, that there's over 1,400 trail associations in the world, and very few of them converse with each other. And so when we look at Minnesota, now we see a ton of vibrant groups. We've got the Cuyuna Lakes Mountain Bike Crew. We've got COGS out in Duluth, Fargo Moorhead Trail Builders, and the Minnesota Off-Road Cyclists, just to name a few. And so what was different about those groups and others, back when you kind of started as the regional director?
Yeah, I mean, for one, some of those groups didn't even exist yet, so that was one difference. But kind of to your point, I was working Minnesota, Wisconsin, Iowa, Missouri at one point, Illinois, and the Upper Peninsula as well. So, one thing I really noticed, and I noticed this early on, not even in my advocacy role, but as a sales rep. For a long time, I was an independent sales rep that drove around the region selling Patagonia clothing and a bunch of other kind of outdoor related products. And I always found this like apologetic attitude from a lot of the stores or the staff I would work with. And I really saw that same thing happening in advocacy when I would go and talk to these different mountain bike groups, is that, they would almost kind of apologize for being Midwest. Like, we don't really have mountain biking here. We drive over to, Colorado every year to get our mountain biking in. We just kind of ride our bikes here. And I really have always felt as a Midwesterner that we've had a unique thing as far as any outdoor activity, not just mountain biking, but all of them, and that it's not an apples to apples kind of comparison, and that we really started to kind of need to take ownership of what we have and celebrate that, and celebrate it in a way that is unique to us, that kind of creates our own brand. And so that intercommunication between clubs is really important, because a lot of times I had to say, hey, have you guys heard what they're doing here and why? And a lot of times I kind of get that, that head shake. Yeah, of course we do. We know exactly what's going on. But the reality was, and kind of back to your earlier question, most of these trails were you needed to know somebody, so you didn't really throw your bike on your car and drive over to Cuyuna to go ride, because most likely what you're going to find there was not what you wanted to find, unless you happen to know the right person, or even cable or a lot of these other kind of destination places around weren't necessarily destination. And so that intercommunication and like literally using photographs for me, which was kind of my main tool, was, going and taking great photography of existing riding. And now instead of saying, have you been there? It's like, hey, look at this. And, started to kind of almost foster this desire for people to actually leave their home trails and go check something else out, and then build on that from there to start saying, well, you could have that where you are as well, and here's the best way to do that. And eventually that started bleeding up to, modern trail building practices and construction and funding and building your organization and, all of the rest. But that intercommunication, you're totally nailing it. And as far as doing that on a national basis or, North American basis or worldwide basis, yeah, that needs to keep going. And that is one role that, IMBA did play at that point, was really trying to pull those people together and create those kind of cross-pollination moments.
Now, let's fast forward to today. And what does Duluth and the rest of the region look like from a mountain biker's point of view?
Yeah. So, it's like I said, if you reel it back 10 years as a mountain biker, for one, as a local, you most likely didn't travel to go try out different places to ride. You might try a few spots here and there, but mainly you're more probably thinking about doing a true ride all the way out, driving all the way out west, or, somewhere more mountain based to do your vacation. So yeah, now all of a sudden you have a lot of really robust clubs that are all investing in their own trail systems, but we're seeing a true, I think, economy that's developed around people actually putting their bikes on their cars and driving, to different places to actually try it. So you're seeing a lot happening on the South Shore of Lake Superior. You're seeing stuff here in Duluth. You're seeing stuff, Cuyuna as well. You're seeing stuff in even the Twin Cities to a certain extent has really started to, blossom as a fun place to go and ride. And there's a lot of other places that are kind of on the radar now that I think within the next 5 years will all be sort of in that same conversation as well. But that's a really big difference. That's a change for Midwest mountain biking. I mean, the other side of it too is the amount of out-of-state plates that are showing up at all of these different places I'm talking about. It's not unusual to go to Cuyuna and see plates from Western states or Canada, or to see the same plates in Duluth or Copper Harbor, and that's really rare. I mean, very rarely would you have heard of someone who drove from Utah to ride in the Midwest. So that's kind of a cool change.
Despite mountain biking really being popularized by word of mouth, we kind of, a lot of mountain bikers put forth this image of not wanting to share their local trails, and we all know that somebody's talking because people are hearing about all this great stuff. But was there kind of some concerns within communities of developing these destination locations, and was there concern that they were going to get too much traffic in them?
Yeah, definitely. I think it's a legit concern. And one thing that I know I very much did as a regional director, especially in these early conversations, was to like literally say, what do you want and why? And really drill down into that, because I think you have a lot of people that want to be the next best place for mountain biking, but they don't really understand what comes with that. It's a very romantic notion, I guess, is the way I'd look at it. And so to have those really hard, straight talks with folks and say, if this is what you really want, here's what it really means. And is that still, the overall positive to what you're trying to do with your mountain bike trail? So, and that, that's where you get into your planning conversation. But, why do you want this? And for me, again, as a regional director, and even now just as an advocate for outdoor recreation in general, not just mountain biking, but overall, is, what do you aspire to greater things with this idea or this project? If this is just about you riding more fun trails, then maybe that's all you're really aspiring to. And that's an okay thing, right? It's like, if you just want to say, we just want to make our trails better and we want to have better riding in our community, and that's where we're going to leave it, then great. But if you're going to be a destination, that's a much different level of commitment and end results. And some of them are really positive and some of them are negative. Like you're going to have more people. That's kind of what your goal is. But because of that, you may also bring some broad social and economic change to your community as a whole that might actually, benefit from that too. So it's not an easy conversation, but it's a valid one.
The Duluth Traverse is a vision for 100 miles of single track. And how does an idea like that begin? And what's the initial steps to make it a reality?
For me, I had lived after, I'd kind of had a couple different times I'd lived in Duluth and had left. And some of that leaving, I lived in Montana for a while. And then I also lived in New England and northern Vermont for a while. And I was very impacted by both in the fact that I was really, really loved to do long backcountry types of rides and also, ski touring and all the things, just that extended experience. And so when I actually moved back to Duluth to work for Patagonia and I was here, a lot of the people that I kind of hung out with at that point, we were still kind of, a lot of us were kind of Midwest expats who had left and come back and would talk about these experiences we'd had in other places. And so we started to do these long rides here in town, kind of linking together all these social trails and all the expanse of the open space we had in town. And 9 times out of 10, they were total failures. We'd try and ride X and it would invariably change because it was just too long or the trail didn't exist anymore or whatever. But it became an annual thing. And so a bunch of us were already kind of doing a kind of hodgepodge, Duluth Traverse back in the, early 2000s and late 90s. So that, that idea I don't think it germinated with any one person. It was something that was actually kind of happening organically. But the idea of starting to truly kind of invest in it and create it started to come from these other experiences in other places. Like really machine built trails was, a thing that was already happening in the Southeast in the 90s. And it had already started to migrate into northern Vermont, even when I was still living there. And you started to see intentional, well-designed, beautiful trail being built in these places and interlinking other things. And so those things all came together with a conversation with myself and a couple other folks from COGS, Adam Sundberg being one of them, saying, we could do this here. Look how our parks lay out. Look how our parks actually interact in our communities. And so that conversation kind of started organically in that regard. And then when I was given the job with IMBA, I started to learn more about all these other best practices and other things and kind of learning about other communities. And then that's when the true Duluth Traverse idea kind of solidified. And Adam was very good at kind of starting to tell that story to COGS as well, as he was the president at the time. And then we also had a very receptive mayor, Mayor Don Ness, he was willing to listen to us, and that kind of set it on its path.
You've kind of mentioned a couple things there, and you talked about a little bit of planning, but organic growth. And so how important is active planning? And at the same time, how much does organic growth come into play when developing a mountain bike community? It sounds like, there was some key partners within the community as well as politically. There were some key partners. I mean, those are opportunities that don't always come by and you need to jump on them. But what role does active planning and what role does organic growth in developing that come in?
Yeah, so that's where a little bit of the black magic comes into play, I think. But, I think there's, as an organization, as a club, there's only so much you can control. You can control what happens within your organization. You can control, how you work with your members and how you govern yourselves and how you kind of create your own vision. And so I think the organic side of it comes from how the culture of your organization grows and what it wants to do and how it creates its own vision. So, that right there was kind of, we got lucky on that from the COG side of it. We happened to have a bunch of really young, fun, energetic folks that saw the vision and wanted to create it and were willing to go to bat for it. But we also were lucky enough to have myself around as well to sort of say, well, if we're going to do that, then we also need to be building these relationships. And to a certain extent, that's kind of out of an organization's control. Like you have to get people on board, right? You have to get the mayor on board and your Parks and Recs department and whoever else is going to kind of be a gatekeeper to whatever it is you're trying to do. And you can go out there and try and create those relationships, but you also have to have them in place. And obviously we don't, as a club, we don't run those relationships. So that's a little bit unknown. That intention and that vision from the club also is what inspires those folks. So I think that organic growth kind of gets that in place. But having that vision and coming to whoever those partners are going to be and saying, we really see how this can play out and how it could impact us. Now we need your help to do a formal plan around it, is really that's where that next big step occurs in a big project.
One thing that we haven't talked about, and this might fall under the category of formal planning versus organic growth and opportunity, but funding for these community projects is huge. And so where can it come from, and how can a trail organization raise the kind of capital that's going to be required for something like a 100-mile long traverse?
Yeah. So that, and again, every community is different based on, where they are, what country they're in, what state they're in, how big they are as a community, which is a big deal. So you're gonna have different strategies for funding in different places. That's just part of it. Some places like Minnesota do have some consistent funding opportunities statewide. Here we have our it's called the Legacy Fund, which is actually a state tax that comes back and actually goes into a larger fund that helps pay for trail related and other recreational, oriented projects. So we're lucky in that regard. It's not easy to get, but it is there. But, for us, what we found was the size of our community. I mean, we happen to be roughly 90,000 people, but we're a tourism draw already. So we already had sort of an existing kind of major, I think Duluth last year had somewhere in the area of 4.5 million tourists come to town. And it's mainly just to see the lake. I wish I could say it was for all these other grandiose things, but the reality is they like to come and stick their foot in the water and say, I touched Lake Superior. But what it really did was it actually created a tourism fund, a pot of money locally within our city that the mayor had some discretion over on how it was spent. So for us, after we kind of really ground truthed our idea and worked through how it could possibly work and brought in some other partners and sort of had the vision, and we actually sat down with the mayor and kind of pitched it. One thing which I think is worth noting and is key for any organization is when we did that initial pitch, we didn't ask for money. We asked just to do it, which was possibly a little naive for us. But the fact of the matter is we came to the table bringing something versus trying to take something. And especially in our community at the time, which has been, kind of struggling with just, resources in general, that was a breath of fresh air for our mayor at that point, where it was like, wow, this is a group of folks that are obviously pretty organized and, are youthful and energetic. And they're actually coming to me and saying, here's how we'd like to create change, and we're going to do it regardless. We just need permission. Not, again, being very naive. But he, being a great leader, realized, I do have some funds that I can help them with. And not only that, he also made it sort of a priority for his Parks and Recs department to help us with them. And which I think, while isn't necessarily tied to the idea of fundraising that you're asking about, it does cost money, and it is a resource that benefited us. And so the actual cash that we were given early on from the city was actually tourism dollars, but it was mainly used to leverage other grants. So he was, again, smart enough to say, I'm not just going to give you, $100,000 to go make, 10 miles of trail or whatever that would result in. I'm giving you $100,000 to go leverage as many grants as possible to make as much trail as you possibly can. And again, it came down to this relationship that had that tourism tax not been there, he probably would have found another source of funds that we could have done a similar thing with, because he really believed in that early vision. But most communities are going to be looking at different grants or local foundations or private donors, and getting into that idea of using those dollars to kind of maximize them.
So something that you said there, I think, is I can see parallels and truths to it for a lot of aspects with organizations, and that is bringing something to the table and contributing, not just asking for something. And I think I see that a lot with sponsorships. When you go to companies to sponsor trail organizations, there's always you should sponsor us because it's the right thing to do. But at the same time, we can offer bike shops and companies and whoever they might be, we can offer them something in return. And I think that's important on all facets, whether you're dealing with government officials or you're dealing with corporate sponsors or anybody. But we bring a lot to the table as mountain bikers, and we can certainly create value add for anybody.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. And I think the one mistake a lot of trails groups make, and not just in mountain biking, but in outdoor recreation in general, is we think too small sometimes. We can be unintentionally very selfish, because a lot of times it comes from us as an end user. We want to create more trails because we want more trails, right? And even I'll hear it come out of folks' mouths. They'll talk a great game, but that still is the end result. And I really challenge groups to think about how whatever it is they're investing in, to think much, much bigger, and how that's going to impact the community as a whole. Like what is the true result of this beyond just more riders? Like what is it going to do on the grand scale? And, I've said it many times, but I don't know what the Canadian analogy would be, but, our local groups are becoming like the next Elks Club or the next Shriners, or whatever that is, right? They're literally social groups. They're not just a mountain bike group anymore. They're actually impacting change on a much bigger level than just mountain biking. And that narrative and that story is really, really important, but also really powerful when it comes to all these other folks you have to get on board. And if they realize, okay, this is beyond just these folks getting on their bikes and jumping on the trail, this is actually going to make much bigger, broader change. And I also say that when I say that is, and some of the things I've learned since, I've worked both with IMBA and now in the role that I'm working in now, is that it's very easy to say that, but it's also very hard to truly show it. So, it's great to say mountain bikes will, get more at-risk youth outside, or you name the social right that it will create, but you need to be able to draw the direct line to what that is and why. And I think that's where, like, planning for me, looking back on what we've done, is we could have even been better at really opening the net wider to even more partners and more folks early on, to really kind of early on engineer how we wanted this trail to impact different communities and different people. And we've come back to that. Like we've gotten to that point where we're doing it now, but it took a lot longer than it probably could have. And I would say if I was looking at other communities as they're doing it, it's like saying, how is this truly going to impact health? And draw that line to your partner with the hospital, right? And the program that they're going to use to actually gauge that and show that is occurring. And if you're saying this truly is going to get more people of color on the trail, then show me exactly how that's going to occur, and bring those partners to the table early on so that they're part of that conversation early on. And too often I found, at some point myself and other mountain bike advocates as well, it was really easy to tell a really quick, easy elevator speech narrative about how mountain biking was going to be good for everybody. But as soon as you dug under the surface, it's really hard to find those really, truly shining examples of where it is truly broadly making change, unless you're intentionally doing it.
What would you recommend to any groups out there?
Planning is just so key, and I had groups fight it like crazy. Like they just didn't want to deal with planning, and planning is just, it's what separates the wins from the losses. Like the groups that really get behind planning and get behind it early on and in all levels are the ones that are seeing the success. And when you go, especially here in the Midwest, and you go through all the places like you're talking about, whether it's Cuyuna or it's Duluth or it's, Marquette or it's Copper Harbor or any of those other places, it's their planning has usually been pretty dialed.
So what do you have in store for 2018? What are you up to right now, and what are you excited about?
Yeah. So, for me, my life really changed a lot when it came to, the job I went from with IMBA to working with the Minnesota Land Trust. And what I ended up doing was actually moving more from just mountain biking to all the outdoor activities in the city. So I was working with the cross-country skiers, with the mountain bikers, with the climbers, the paddlers, the hikers, just like the full round. And so I've kind of had to expand to now, instead of just working with one user group, to literally all the outdoor user groups in the city. So I have like 7 different projects going on. And 2018 is going to be awesome to see more of the Duluth Traverse get built. We are at I think 95 miles out of the 100. So we're getting down to those kind of final miles, but it's always exciting, at the last 5 years to see new trails popping up. So you're always looking forward to the next one. But then I'm also looking forward to all these other projects that we're doing, like the ice climbing park and the paddling trail and everything else starting to kind of coalesce as well. Because I feel like that broad front for us is really important to move beyond just mountain biking and move into like the outdoor city as a whole. I'm also looking forward to kind of like some of the changes that will occur within the organization, COGS itself, and how they kind of start to resurrect or reframe what they're doing and start thinking more about maintenance versus construction.
Well, Hansi, thank you so much for taking the time to chat with me today. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, you bet. Thank you. And if you have anything else, just give me a call.
I wanted to highlight some of the things that Hansi said, and the first is the question he would ask any community looking at developing their trails. Why are you doing this, and what do you as a community want to get out of developing your trail network? Knowing the why of a project is as important as knowing the who of your organization itself. It comes back to that elevator pitch. Over this season of the podcast, we'll be hearing about a few major projects, and I want to peel back the onion on each of them. All too often, the public only sees the finished project, or in those negative situations, that big old rejection that we get from city council or the land manager. When we're dealing with major community changing trail projects and initiatives, I really want to dig into the minutia of what makes them possible and hear about all the hurdles that come along the way. If you have a project that you want to share, then reach out and let's discuss it. Another theme that we will keep discussing, and something else that Hansi mentioned, was the factors that an organization can control. Member engagement, governance, and creating a vision, just to name a few. You can send me an email or audio file at frontlinesmtb@gmail.com. Or you can find the show on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter at FrontlinesMTB. You can also stream the show on YouTube and SoundCloud. In mid-October, I was given the opportunity to pitch the podcast at the Mountain Equipment Outdoor Nation. It was a great experience. I learned a ton, and I met a bunch of passionate people, some you'll be hearing from in future episodes. And I'm happy to finally be able to share that Mountain Equipment Co-op awarded the Frontlines podcast with a $1,000 social media grant. You may have noticed the new logo, courtesy of Brandon Gallagher Watson. That's just one of the few things that will be receiving an upgrade over the next few months. In order to keep the show alive, I do depend on donations from you via PayPal. You can find a link to that in the show notes, as well as links to the Duluth Traverse and the folks at COGS. Remember, you can also support the show by purchasing some reading from the Frontlines MTB Book Club page on the website. I'll be discussing the very first selection with some guests on an upcoming episode, so if you haven't read On Trail and Exploration by Robert Moore, I highly recommend getting it soon. I'll have a new episode for you on February 2nd. Music is once again by Lee Rosevier, and production notes by Jennifer Pride. And finally, I'm Brent Hillier. This is Frontlines. Thanks for listening, and happy trails.